Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode in the Globe webinar series on the future of global governance. I am Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today, we are joined by Professor Allison Carnegie and Professor Austin Carson to discuss their book, Secrets in Global Governance, Disclosure Dilemmas and the Challenge of International Cooperation, published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. Allison Carnegie is Associate Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. Her research interests include international relations, international organizations, and international political economy. Austin Carson is Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. His main research focus is the politics of secrecy in international relations. Also joining us today as discussant is Professor Yoram Haftel. Yoram is Professor and Giancarlo Elia Valori Chair in the Study of Peace and Regional Cooperation, and the Department Chair in the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Yoram's research focuses on international political economy, international institutions and organizations, trade and investment agreements, and regional integration. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Allison and Austin of about 30 minutes, and then Yoram will start off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions to which the authors will have an opportunity to respond. Then we'll turn to questions from you, the audience. Please send questions to me throughout the webinar by using the webinar chat box function at the bottom of the webinar window. I will collect your questions to share with the speakers following the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the GLOBE project. Funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, GLOBE seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with specific attention to four key areas: trade and development, security and migration, climate change, and global finance. The 3.5-year project aims to identify the major roadblocks to effective and coherent global governance by multiple stakeholders in a multipolar world, as well as to look ahead to 2030 and 2050 to equip policymakers with the tools they will need to deal with future challenges. On behalf of the GLOBE project, I would like to thank Allison, Austin, and Yoram for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to pass the floor to Austin to start us off.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. Hello, everyone. And on behalf of both Allison and myself, I just want to say to start, thank you to the Leuven Center, the GLOBE Project, to Carrie and to Yoram for the invitation and for giving us the chance to share some of our research from our book. So as Carrie mentioned, I'm Austin Carson and coming to you from Chicago, where the sun is just now rising, as you see behind me. And I'm thrilled to be able to talk about this book that Allison and I worked on and was published last year with Cambridge University Press. And what we're going to do today is give a short summary where we'll cover two empirical areas in the book, nuclear nonproliferation and world trade, as well as give an overview of the theory and conceptual framework of the book. And we're really looking forward to hearing comments and questions from all of you. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity. So to start, part of the motivation for the book comes from a puzzling phenomenon of governments withholding information from global governance institutions. So two examples demonstrate this phenomenon, we think, in an interesting way. One is in the late 1990s, Brazil and Canada had a dispute over subsidies in the aircraft industry by their governments to private companies manufacturing aircraft. And Canada had information from a firm in its territory in this dispute that could have helped exonerate it, held its case in the dispute, but chose to hold it back. And a parallel situation happened actually over a decade earlier, when in the 1980s, the United States had intelligence-based information about North Korea's nuclear weapons program that could have facilitated a multilateral response, but chose not to share that information. And so the book asks the question, why? Why did Canada and the United States hesitate? And we point to, in the book, the reason as the dangers of disclosing what we call sensitive information. And in the book, we really want to analyze and lay out how international organizations, the formal institutions themselves, have adapted over time to accommodate sensitive national security and economic information in an effort to improve cooperation. Now, the basic argument we lay out in the book is that this speaks to a broader information problem in the international system, which has been relatively underappreciated in the literature and scholarship in international relations. That information problem takes the following form for us. First, states and economic firms and individual people oftentimes have unique insights relevant to questions of compliance with international norms and international law, but fear publicizing those sensitive details. And just sharing the conclusions rather than the actual details that these states and firms have is not credible. Just saying we're innocent, we didn't violate the rules, is not going to convince anyone, and in a legal sense will not establish innocence, so to speak. And so when governments or firms are in this situation where they have insights about compliance but fear publicizing such sensitive details, we describe that as being in the context of a disclosure dilemma, one of the central concepts we develop in the book. That information problem we pair in the book with developing an institutional solution. As I noted, international organizations in our formulation can help address this problem, and they do so through what we call confidentiality systems, or in a word, secrecy systems. These confidentiality systems, when international organizations have them, allow these institutions to receive, protect, and use sensitive information. It's disclosed directly to them rather than publicly. And then the international organization can disseminate conclusions informed by that sensitive information, as well as other information about whether or not compliance is taking place. And the result, when it works, we argue, is that there's an improvement in the quality of global governance because insights that were previously withheld are now being passed along and integrated, as well as hopefully improvements in the actual performance of cooperation, whether or not the goals of the institution, such as non-proliferation of nuclear weapons or the facilitation of trade, rules-based trade, is improved. Now, why do we think this matters? A few things to think about in terms of the so what question. So first is that we think that this provides something of a new perspective on the role of global governance institutions and how international cooperation unfolds in the international system. First of all, we observed that there's not a lot of research currently on the role of national security intelligence or business secrets in global governance and in international cooperation. We also think the book, in highlighting this function of IOs, provides an interesting contrast to the canonical view of the role of such institutions in addressing other kinds of information problems, going all the way back to Cohen, but many others have developed and articulated the idea that these institutions simply collect information and publicize that information to make it easier for states and non-state actors to know whether or not the rules of the game are being observed. We, of course, don't directly dispute that idea, but we add this wrinkle that some information needs to be disclosed confidentially in order for that to actually work. And lastly, we think it provides a new perspective on a range of issue areas, security, economics, as well as human rights, which we'll talk about some of in a second. But we emphasize it's also important to study this because it's not all good news. So while we oftentimes will be talking about the cooperation improvements that can result from this process, there are two important downsides to be upfront about. Number one is that there is a clear transparency trade-off. Equipping these institutions with confidentiality trades off with their ability to be transparent or visible to their operations being visible to outside actors. So it might raise the question that more effective cooperation, at least in some contexts, demands less transparency. Secondly is aspects of power that become bound up in this process and in these institutions. The choice to disclose this information is itself a form of influence. And powerful states, moreover, have more intelligence, for example, and can disclose it selectively than some other states. And so when institutions can perform this function, they do open themselves up to an avenue of potential influence and the exertion of power. We develop a specific idea about that regarding the disclosure of intelligence about allies rather than non-allies, which I'll talk about in a minute. Finally, we think that this is useful because it provides new insights potentially about the future of multilateralism. So in other work, we've developed how disclosure dilemmas might be relevant in something like the COVID-19 global health response, or in new areas such as cybersecurity, where sensitive information, again, from individuals, firms, or states might be relevant to questions of compliance, but also might be very difficult to get actors to disclose. Moreover, we think that there is a role here, potentially, that we've sketched out for secrecy as part of a reformed or revitalized multilateralism. And we think it's important to have this conversation, honestly, about what transparency or non-transparency is going to go along with effective or ineffective multilateralism. So I want to quickly just lay out the basics of the theory that we develop in the book. As I said, it starts with this information problem, an information and compliance issue, where the visibility of compliance in general is actually quite hard to establish. Part of that is because we argue state and private actors have these unique insights about how harmful noncompliance is, or the existence of noncompliance, the intentionality behind evading compliance. And in a perfect world, of course, these actors would disclose it. But we lay out some reasons why this kind of information is oftentimes sensitive. Public disclosure of, say, national security intelligence may reveal sources and methods, the way that intelligence was collected. So states might then balk before disclosing it. And the same goes for economic information that might do damage to a firm's bottom line. We refer to those generally as adaptation costs. The result is a disclosure dilemma where an actor is torn between improving knowledge of compliance and adding to the clarity of that situation, including sometimes in ways that help them in terms of exonerating them from accusations of noncompliance, versus avoiding those kinds of adaptation costs that might be relevant. So the question, of course, the theory asks is there a way out? And we develop a basic way in which international institutions, or institutions more broadly, can serve this kind of role. The basic idea, as this sort of flow chart demonstrates, is that an international organization with what we call confidentiality systems can do two things. The IO can protect sensitive information from wider disclosure. So an actor can disclose it directly to the IO, and that information does not go further than the international organization's bureaucracy. At the same time, the IO can use that information, look at it itself, pair it along with its expertise with other sources of information to better establish whether or not compliance is taking place and in what situations and with what consequences. We then lay out how these two functions correspond to the two costs and benefits that underlie these disclosure dilemmas. The IO protecting information from wider disclosure helps mitigate the adaptation costs for sensitive information, while at the same time, the IO vetting and integrating that information itself to better assess compliance allows states and other actors to better understand the compliance picture, which we refer to as capturing incrimination benefits, incrimination being evidence with a situation of noncompliance of wrongdoing. The ultimate outcomes that we're interested in are twofold, two dependent variables, is that we think when there's a confidentiality system in an international organization, we should see more frequent disclosures of the sensitive information, and down the line, improved cooperation on the issue areas that are relevant. Without an IO confidentiality mechanism, the natural reaction is to withhold this information, and then it's harder to answer questions like how damaging was a tariff. But a confidentiality system at an IO, when it works well, can provide a third option between staying quiet or withholding and going public or disclosing publicly. They can integrate that sensitive information and avoid those adaptation costs. Those two dependent variables we translate into two hypotheses or observable applications, which we adapt in 4 different empirical chapters that I'll lay out in a second in different forms. The first basic hypothesis, again, is about disclosure rates. IO confidentiality systems, our theory expects, should increase the rate at which states and non-state actors disclose sensitive information. Moreover, however, states, although not other non-geopolitical actors, should sort of tailor the degree to which they disclose that information to adjust to whether or not the relevant actor is a rival or a partner. So that integrates that idea that there's this possibility of selective disclosure, in particular because states don't necessarily want to provide sensitive or non-sensitive information that gets partners of theirs or allies of theirs in trouble. The second hypothesis corresponds to that bottom line cooperation outcome, where we argue, we think the theory implies that integrating sensitive information via confidentiality should help identify and assess noncompliance and boost cooperation. So as I said, we look at this in the book in 4 areas, which correspond to the following 4 rows in this table. We'll talk more about nuclear proliferation and trade in a minute when I hand it over to Allison. I just want to quickly give you a sketch of the other 2 areas. We look at war crimes, and in particular, the international criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, where we look at the role of integrating national security intelligence in trying to identify instances of war crimes and attribute sort of causal responsibility for that up the chain of command. In another chapter, we look at foreign direct investment, where we look at how the addition or actually the loss of confidentiality at some of the international bodies where disputes about foreign direct investment between firms and host governments are adjudicated, that the loss of that confidentiality has actually led to less disclosure of sensitive information. In doing all of this, we try to add to sort of scholarly data on features of IOs, namely their confidentiality features, as well as some other sorts of data, such as the redactions that are present in WTO reports, which we, as Allison will talk about, use to measure whether or not sensitive information is being disclosed. We also use interviews and archival documents to help get some light on relatively difficult and opaque things like intelligence disclosures in our chapters on the IAEA and the war crimes tribunals. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Allison to talk about nuclear and trade and wrap things up. And then I look forward to hearing from both Yoram and all of you.
Great, thanks. So next slide, thanks. Right, so here we are in the domain of nuclear proliferation. We're looking specifically at intelligence and nuclear non-proliferation compliance. And so in this domain, imagery and other sensitive information can help to identify nuclear infrastructure, procurement networks, and spotlight evidence of inspections evasion. The problem is that disclosing this intelligence risks adaptation to intelligence collection methods. So you could think of a country revealing their sources and methods, and that can give another country a boost when it comes to national security. And so details are key though, because countries cannot just claim that a violation occurred without evidence, because that's just simply not credible. They might have incentives to lie. And so what we expect is that better confidentiality at the IAEA should have resulted in more information shared about non-allies in particular, which is who states would have an incentive to share information about, and to create a more effective international organization. Next slide. And so to test this, we have 2 dependent variables and 2 independent variables. So we look first directly at intelligence disclosures, and we collected new data on US intelligence disclosures to the IAEA. And we collected this from a variety of sources. So we used archival methods, we interviewed more than 40 elites, we used secondary sources, so looking for any mentions of US intelligence disclosures, asking whether any occurred. So we wouldn't necessarily view what the disclosure was, but we could tell that a disclosure occurred. And then for our second dependent variable, we're going to look downstream a little more to see the effectiveness of the IAEA. So was the IAEA able to close enrichment or reprocessing facilities, which is really a strong test. And so if we found evidence of this, we think it would be especially indicative. And then our first independent variable is ally status, which we use ATOP data, and that will indicate whether a state had a geopolitical interest in providing this information or not. And then our second independent variable is the 1991 IAEA reforms. So following the sort of debacle at the IAEA following the Gulf War, they reformed in order to be able to receive and protect intelligence in the way that we theorize. And so we use the advent of these reforms to look before and after in a difference in difference design for allies versus non-allies. And so we do case studies on each case. And so we have the full universe of cases here. And so as you can see, this table just shows sort of broadly speaking patterns that are consistent with our theory. And so you can see that we have within case variation and across case variation. And so for non-allies, in the pre-reform period, generally speaking, intelligence was not shared and facilities were not closed. And you can see under H1 question mark, H2 question mark, we indicate where this will indicate strong evidence of our theory, moderate evidence of our theory, or weak evidence of our theory. And in contrast, if it was after the reform period for a non-ally, intelligence was often shared and facilities were often closed in part as a result of this intelligence. And so we code each case and we see these patterns that are strongly in favor of our theory. And we also, you know, in the book, we provide a case on each country, but here we just, to give you a flavor of the cases, we'll just talk briefly about one of the cases, North Korea. And so, as we detail in the book, in the pre-IAEA reform period, which was the 1980s here, the US actually possessed unique intelligence about the Yongbyon site, which was starting in the mid-1980s. And so the US knew that there was a nuclear reactor producing spent fuel. It knew about conventional high explosive testing. It knew about a reprocessing facility for separating plutonium, and it knew about waste storage activity. And the US, however, did not disclose any of this intelligence, and the IAEA remained unable to act, which really hindered its performance in this area. But then we see that after the IAEA reforms in the 1990s, the US did share intelligence with the institution, particularly given these reforms and North Korea's status as a non-ally, as our theory would predict. So the US briefed the IAEA before its visit, and it shared a lot of US satellite imagery that showed North Korea's deception of the IAEA, of their inspectors rather, regarding waste storage building. And so we saw that the US did indeed disclose this intelligence, and that this intelligence helped the IAEA do its work. So as a result, there was a secretariat report on North Korea to the Board of Governors and a vote to demand access. Now, North Korea refused, but diplomacy yielded the agreed framework, which addressed the plutonium path. And so, you know, we did a lot of interviews, but just to highlight one quote that we think is particularly striking, that reforms to address the disclosure dilemma fears, as one interview put it, over the years, the intelligence community has become much, much more comfortable with sharing information with someone like the IAEA. And that is exactly what we would predict. So pivoting now to international trade, here the disclosure dilemmas result not as a result of intelligence information, but actually sensitive business details. And so what we use here is the WTO's original information system versus its transition to a new confidentiality system. So prior to this transition, the default procedures gave wide access to disclosed information. And then we look at the advent of the Boeing Airbus dispute, which was an extremely high profile case that involved highly sensitive information and government information, because Boeing Airbus both had ties to the defense industries. And so the WTO created a new system specifically for this case, but which it continued to use after, where it developed a new category of highly sensitive business information, along with new infrastructure like standalone computers, a locked room in the secretariat, a small list of authorized users. And this was really important because all this highly sensitive information was relevant to the case and needed to adjudicate the case and to adjudicate cases involving sensitive information going forward. And so we think that this new system really increased confidence that the WTO was able to protect information. So countries saw that even in the case of Boeing Airbus, when there was so much sensitive information relevant, the WTO did not leak it and did not disclose it. And so we thought that this reform should lead to more information sharing with the WTO once countries became comfortable with it and the WTO was set up to protect it, and more trade, especially in industries where sensitive information is common. So we can again use a difference in difference design, looking before and after the confidentiality system reforms in industries with and without sensitive information that's relevant to the case. And so here we collected new data on sensitive economic information disclosures. And this is interesting because so the WTO issues panel reports for every case. And you can see in these reports places where information was redacted. Now you can't see what information was redacted, but you can see that a redaction occurred. And so we took that as evidence that sensitive information was shared because they felt the need to redact it. And so our first dependent variable is this new data on redactions in WTO panel and appellate body reports. And then our second dependent variable is trade flows between countries, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And then our first independent variable is dispute timing. So as I mentioned, these key reforms happened in 2004. So we use an indicator of did this dispute happen before or after these reforms in 2004. And then our second independent variable is the severity of adaptation costs. And we actually look at this in two different ways. So in our first test, we look by dispute type, because anti-dumping and subsidy cases often involve a lot of firm level details. So these are, evidence of behind the scenes subsidizing of firms and industries, or dumping products on the market, for which contract details are really key. And so these cases in particular should involve a lot of sensitive information. And then we also look by industry, because we have a measure of contract intensity of different industries, meaning, if you buy an apple, there's usually an exchange where the price is very consistent across different countries and different providers. But if you buy something like a piece of electronics, that might have more contract intensive details. And what we find is that there were more redactions in the WTO reports after the reform, especially in anti-dumping and subsidy disputes. And that's consistent with more disclosures of sensitive information coming after the reforms, as I mentioned. And then this is robust to alternative dependent variable measures and model specifications. And then we also find evidence of downstream trade impacts. So we use logged imports, as I mentioned, as our DV here, and we find that they're higher after the reforms, which to us, and especially in contract intensive industries, which to us indicates that the dispute settlement body is working more effectively after the reforms. And so just to kind of wrap up, our book develops a new theory for how IOs address a unique information cooperation problem. It builds on, but also modifies, the conventional story about IOs and about transparency. And as we've mentioned, we evaluate this using new data, original archival work, elite interviews. And as Austin mentioned, the caveat is that state disclosures are influenced by geopolitical interests. So it's not the case that once these confidentiality reforms are implemented, everything's great. There are trade-offs, and one of them is that states powerful states with intelligence can disclose it selectively. And another is that secrecy in global governance is an awkward fit. There's a big push towards transparency, and this pushes back against that. And so, to the extent that normatively we think transparency might be good, secrecy can be an awkward fit. And so we, as we mentioned, we've addressed this recurring problem in security, economics, and human rights. And we think there are many, many extensions to this, to disease, Austin mentioned COVID, in finance, in the environment, in peacekeeping, and cyber. We're happy to talk about the sensitive information in those domains and what that looks like. And so we also think we're bridging these issue areas that are normally assessed in isolation. And we'd like to conduct some future research, and we think our work could spark some future research, such as additional downstream consequences, the causes of these confidentiality reforms, as well as applications to new empirical domains. So thanks so much, and we look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Allison and Austin, for this presentation and the very interesting arguments that you have presented. Now I'd like to give the floor to Yoram to kick off today's discussion. But before I do, I'd also like to remind the audience that the chat box is at the bottom of the webinar window, and you can send your questions to me now using this chat box, and we will turn to the audience Q&A after we hear from Yoram and the authors one more time. Yoram, we now turn to you.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and thank you also to Axel Marks, who invited me to discuss this book. And thank you to Allison and Austin for writing this book, which I really, really liked, especially, like the idea of discussing a book by a fellow Buckeye. So that's an added bonus. And I really like, I think this is a great book. I think this is a really wonderful book, tailored really nicely, both theoretically and empirically. And I guess, at the most basic level, I really like the pattern, right? The pattern and the counterintuitive argument. And I think in some ways, this book joins kind of a series of challenges to, I guess, the conventional neoliberal institutionalist perspective. And we have now work on the dissolution of international organizations and so on. And I think this book is another kind of twist, if you will, on the idea that transparency is always good, and IOs promote transparency. And starting from Keohane and moving forward, we tend to think that transparency is a really good thing, and IOs should be more transparent. And Austin and Allison are telling us, let's hold on for a minute and think about this again, because actually transparency is not always a good thing. And I realize that this is a really, really good premise, and something I did not think about before I read the book, and now when I read it, I said, wow, this actually makes a lot of sense. So again, a very an interesting puzzle, a counterintuitive argument. This is a very good way to start any work, and certainly this book. Second, I really like the theoretical framework. I think it's very sophisticated. It made a lot of sense to me. I think how you kind of parse these things, the different kinds of information, and the dilemma that you present. I mean, to me, I really liked it. I think to me, I found it convincing. So that's another positive thing, and I think we have to say three good things, right? So the third one is of course that's from Chicago. I think the pipe series. You have to say three good things before you say the bad things. Anyway, so no, seriously, I think the book is really rich empirically. It's very comprehensive. You have 4 case studies in very different issue areas, and each of them you do a lot of work, both quantitative, qualitative interviews. So you clearly spend a lot of time and efforts, trying to get to the bottom of these issues in a lot of different issue areas, and both economics and security and human rights. I guess we'll put in the security rubric perhaps, but this is again very, very impressive empirical work. I would say I'll probably return to that later. I did think that some case studies are more developed than others, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But again, I think wonderful book, and certainly well deserved all the prizes and awards it received. I do say now turning to perhaps somewhat more constructive criticism, or some comments perhaps. So I said I really like the combination of security and economics, but I think it's also sometimes creates tension between the two. We talk about very different strategic environments when you talk about security and states, and it comes across very clearly in the, especially in the case that you presented, Allison, on the IAEA. But to me, this is very different from from investment on trade, where we are involved in private actors, firms, and so on. So in some sense, it was. I mean, I think it's good to kind of compare the two, but it's also creates some tensions. But I think you're very well aware of this tension, and you explain it, I think, well in the book. So it's not a big a concern to me. But I guess something that is more perhaps more of a problem, more for questions, I guess, is when you think of it, three of your 4 cases are on dispute settlement rather than ISOs in general. So they certainly the human rights, the war crimes courts, it's mostly about dispute settlements. The WTO is really about the DSM system. It's not really about the WTO more broadly. And certainly the investment chapters is about again disputes. And so out of the 4 cases, we end up with 3 that are involving courts of some sorts. Obviously, the different courts or the different dispute settlement systems are very different, but still you have only one case, the IAEA, that is not about dispute settlement. And it made me wonder whether all confidentiality, sorry, or secrecy, that's easier to say, is really about something that goes on, in disputes. And we know probably from domestic politics too, when you're involving a dispute, there should be some secrecy for all sorts of reasons that don't necessarily have to do much with IOs. So I wonder whether this is a theory about IOs or a theory about dispute settlement systems. And in your defense, I will say that in the last chapter, in the conclusion, you actually discuss some other cases like the IMF, the World Bank, that perhaps useful to counter this claim. But I was wondering what your thoughts on this point. Okay, another thing, turning to the issue of institutional design, and here I really like the theory, as I said, but there's some tension here because you don't really explain why some IOs have more confidentiality system. We'll be able to say it until the end of the webinar than others, right? And I really like chapter 3, but I would really like to see it more developed, right? Why do we see more secrecy in some IOs in sometimes in others? And the way I read it is that it's not really a rational process, right? There's some path dependence there, some technological change, some perhaps external shocks, and this does not necessarily sit comfortably with the very rational theory that you have in terms of the implications of secrecy, right? And I think that's okay. And you also touch on this in the conclusion as well, which again I think is raising some interesting questions. But for me, that was something I would like to know more about, to say the least. And again, I think you touch it toward the end of the book, but to me, it's not necessarily either or, right? So with technological change, with IOs becoming much more central to global governance, then they are both becoming more transparent and more secret at the same time, right? And so I was wondering whether there's this evolution or development of secrecy in IOs is just, again, a part of IOs becoming more significant in international cooperation. So again, you are talking about it, but I would like to know more about it. Also in terms of kind of the descriptives of explaining, variation across IOs in terms of design. That was really interesting to me, and you kind of touch on it relatively briefly in this book. But I guess you have to have things to do for the next book, so that's fine. So I guess I don't want to get too specific here. I would say that I was perhaps more. I guess I found the chapter on the global investment regime as the most interesting. That's my personal bias, because probably I know more about that. But I guess I also found it the least convincing. And there are some questions for me how much the empirical analysis actually shows what you're suggesting it shows. I would say in general that you see some imbalance in terms of the chapters, and just by counting the page numbers, I think the chapter on IAEA is probably 3 times as long than the chapter on ICSID and the global investment regime, and that's also I think comes across in the text. Again, I'll say very briefly, and again, I don't think we need to develop it that far. That much, but I wasn't convinced that these changes in transparency rule in UCITRAL are really that central to the global regime. I think both ICSID, which is not quite an IO, not necessarily, certainly not in the way that an IO in trade. ICSID it's important, but has a very specific role and pretty, I wouldn't say secondary, but certainly not central to the regime. And also these reforms, these UCITRAL reforms are, I think, relatively I wouldn't say they revolutionized the rules of the regime, and then to argue that this one reform decision actually affected FDI, I found it a bit of a stretch. But again, that's something that we can perhaps discuss later. So I think I'm running out of time probably. I guess I want to touch on two questions that I was interested in. You mentioned them as good topics for further research, but hopefully you have some time to reflect on these issues since you published the book. And one is the issue of regime complexity, and what happens, right? You treat each IO separately, but how do we conceptualize the large number of IOs, and how do IOs interact with each other when it comes to issues of secrecy or transparency? And if I remember correctly, towards the end of the book, you say that actually this might discourage cooperation, because when IOs hold information and don't share it with other IO, that makes cooperation between different international organizations more difficult, and states might form shop for the IOs that keep their information safe. But another option would be along Tyler Pratt's article is about deference, where there are options for some IOs that don't have the capacity to keep information confidential to rely on other IOs, right? So this could be a different, perhaps a more positive perspective on regime complexity and overlap and things like that. This is kind of a general question, whether you had any thoughts on this issue. I'll finish with one question. Again, I'm also a member of the GLOBE consortium, and we work a lot about the European Union, and you don't really touch on the EU in your book. And my question was, do you have any insights or reflections on the EU from your other case studies? How do you see the EU in this area of secrecy, transparency, and so on? And how does it fit within the kind of broader global governance structure that we have today? And I'll finish here. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Yoram. I will quickly now pass to Austin and Allison, and also to remind the audience that the Q&A will begin shortly, so please send your questions to me with the chat box. All right, over to you, Allison and Austin.
Allison, do you want to start with a couple, and then I'll sort of join in with and round it out?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you so much for those helpful comments. That was really thorough and gave us some interesting things to think about moving forward as well. And we really appreciate your careful read of the manuscript and just the thought you put into this. So yeah, I think a lot of these are also just fascinating directions for future work, and to things that we will continue to grapple with as we move forward. I particularly am interested in several of your points, but especially I think the regime complexity point is really fascinating. And recent work has pointed to the implications of increased regime complexity, and I think that is sort of a natural point to continue with our story as this becomes more salient. And so one direction that I've thought about a bit and would like to continue thinking about is IOs signing information sharing agreements. So that's maybe another option that you didn't highlight in your comments that I think could be very interesting. So we do see some information sharing agreements, for example, between development banks and in other areas of global governance. And I'm actually just really interested in the conditions under which IOs trust each other enough to sign these kinds of agreements, whether states know about them, whether it discourages information sharing by states if their information would go to multiple organizations. And I just think, and whether they make IOs more or less effective, because on the one hand, you might think that they make them more effective because these IOs can all work on using the same information and just be more informed. But on the other hand, they might be less effective if states stop sharing with the original IO, for example. So anyway, I think that's a great area for future work, and I would like to explore that more. And why there's more secrecy in some IOs rather than others, I also think it's a very fascinating question. My initial thought would just be that, you know, part of it could be sort of a functionalist argument where when the need for secrecy is really high, then the IO is very important to specific problems that states have, then they will adopt secrecy measures, and otherwise no, because in our work we did see a lot of reticence to incorporate any secrecy measures. And so there had to be some sort of big push or big shock in order to convince states to allow IOs to handle their sensitive data. And so, peacekeeping comes to mind, for example, and this kind of gets to your point too about how whether this is a story about IOs becoming more significant in international cooperation. And I think partly that's the case, but also changing technologies and changing just sort of the nature of information flows and global governance and the nature of what states need from IOs. So like peacekeeping is a point that comes to mind because, it used to be the case that I guess, the UN didn't have a particular, so intelligence would have helped the UN in terms of peacekeeping. Intelligence was needed to identify, for example, the locations of rebels and their weapons and their capabilities and just on the ground movement, strategy, tactics, all kinds of issues. But as intelligence information got better, as it could be accessed in real time, as it was just, I guess, more detailed, and so more necessary for peacekeeping operations, that's really when we saw the level of secrecy step up. And so I think it probably depends on some combination of a functional argument of what's needed and the presence of some shock where the IO might fail in some important way, and then everybody realizes, oh, we need to prevent this kind of failure, and it can create sort of the political space to adopt this sort of secrecy. So I don't have necessarily like a clean answer for you, but I have a couple different factors that I think really matter about when IOs adopt secrecy and which ones do. And then I feel that in our work, we thought that some information could be just too secret to ever share with IOs. And so maybe you wouldn't see secrecy in such cases, but then some information might be kind of mundane or available from open source information. And so you might not see secrecy capabilities there either. And so we kind of thought of it as sort of a continuum. And our argument would apply more, I think, to sort of the middle cases. Austin, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, again, echoing Allison, Yoram, these comments are awesome, especially all the positives. Those are really valuable to hear, and appreciate your kind words there. So let me pick up where Allison was on this question that Yoram raises about explaining the variation in confidentiality systems across IOs. Definitely something that we somewhat had to bracket in the book, but I think for those on the call, this is a very open opportunity for future research to make this a dependent variable rather than looking at its consequences, which is really what we look at. And just to add to what Allison said, I think there's a couple other things I think are interesting to be thinking about that explain why some IOs or many IOs maybe adopt confidentiality or not. One is learning within the institution itself. And we do see some evidence of that in some of our cases where it takes failure in an institution before member states and the institution itself is willing to cross the Rubicon and adopt a secrecy measure. And so that has like sort of an interesting sort of internal learnings vibe to it. The other thing that I think that Yoram mentioned that we talked about in our third chapter is, we hint at least, is broader systemic norms, where we show, that the transparency and its expectation in international institutions varies over time itself. And the degree to which, confidentiality or secrecy is at odds with that may explain some of the large scale timing of shifts in these types of features. And lastly, one thing that we really kept noticing was the depth of cooperation, how challenging it was to comply with the rules. Sometimes seems to correlate with whether or not confidentiality systems emerge in a particular IO. Because when your promise is relatively shallow and the ability to verify it is not too difficult, you don't need that sensitive information. But when you've made a promise that requires a really sort of intrusive under the hood look to understand whether or not a given state or non-state actors in compliance, that's when this information seems most useful. So that's also something that I think would be an interesting direction to research. I do want to quickly reflect at least a little bit on one of the first issues that Yoram mentioned, which is this role of sort of like dispute settlement or courts, and whether or not that seems to be producing some of the confidentiality that we're focused on. So I think that's totally fair observation that 3 of the 4 have some sort of dispute settlement type framework, and in fact an institutional role in settling that dispute. I think that's the key. And so Allison mentioned one exception, which we don't go into a lot of depth about, but we do think is an interesting area for future research, which is peacekeeping. And peacekeeping there, I think, is a really excellent example of a non-dispute role for sensitive information, where that disclosed intelligence is actually for sort of situational awareness for the peacekeepers on the ground. And there's a long history of trying to integrate that, and it's some failures, missteps along the way, but that's a really interesting place to look for some examples outside the context of dispute settlement. But I think the broader lesson to learn from that is that there's a lot of future research to be done on the interaction between confidentiality systems and other IO design features. Because what Yoram's really highlighting is that when you have delegated to an institution the role of assessing compliance and maybe even judging compliance, then this information is more important. When you haven't delegated that role, it might play less of an important role. And there are other design features of IOs going all the way back to the rational design layout and other design features people have looked at that you might see future research explore how those interact. So I'll leave it at that because I know some folks probably have questions or comments. I'm gonna leave it to Carrie for to hear some of those.
Thank you so much for this. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and so I think we'll have time for 2 or 3. So I will present those now, and then you can respond. So first, there's a few questions related to this sort of balance that you've mentioned between transparency and secrecy. And you've just discussed a bit how and why IOs might arrive at deciding to implement more secrecy or more confidentiality measures. But perhaps you could go into a little bit whether you see a trend towards IOs adopting more such measures, or if you think that the overall push for more transparency, which has definitely been high on the agenda for many organizations and for many civil society organizations, if you think that that is likely to dampen, I guess, progress in this area, if you see it like that. And then we have another question sort of related, and also related to the point that Yoram was making about the European Union. The European Union has announced in the context of its trade policy a new transparency package, which is a set of proposals to make trade policy and trade negotiations even more transparent and disclose more information to the public, to NGOs, et cetera. Do you think this is a good idea, or would this undermine the effectiveness of EU trade policy? And then a third question is, do you see the potential for different levels of engagement with IO's confidentiality systems by different governments? For instance, would some states be more likely than others to disclose sensitive information, perhaps to potentially exonerate themselves? Which states might be less likely to engage? We're also thinking of recent trends of skepticism and contestation against the multilateral system by some states. Are these states less likely to engage in such systems? Are they less likely to trust these systems? Some IOs are held at a pretty short leash by the member states. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. And I think that's all the time we have for questions.
Great, thanks so much. These are excellent questions. I think whether the first one of whether secrecy dampens sort of transparency pushes and progress, I don't think I think it can, but I don't think it necessarily has to be at odds with each other. So Austin and I have discussed, for example, how you could have very transparent procedures, but then the actual sensitive details could still be withheld. And in that way, so the WTO is a good example how it issues panel reports, but also with redactions. And so it's kind of a mixture of transparency with secrecy. And then at least participants can feel comfortable that the process and the procedure and the participants are all following this very transparent procedure, even if the actual details of it are occasionally withheld. There's more to say there, but we probably don't have time, and I'll leave some for Austin. And then in terms of the transparency package and trade policy, so this actually, I think, taps into the broader literature too, on whether transparency is good or bad, helpful, not helpful. I don't know if good or bad is the right way to put it, but helpful or not helpful in different situations. So, from our book's perspective, as long as sensitive details are still protected, I don't see any harm that would come from that. But there's a lot of other work on downsides of transparency. So whether transparency can be helpful or harmful, I think depends on how it's implemented and at which parts of the process. So, there's the argument that if, for example, negotiations are more transparent, then leaders and negotiators will have to posture for different audiences. Or, if NGOs or others are allowed in the room, then bargains might be harder to reach. It depends on, so I guess it depends on how exactly it's implemented. Happy to talk more about that. Maybe I'll turn it to Austin.
Sure. So the one thing to add, I think, from my perspective on the first question, which I think is a great one, is the trend towards more secrecy in IOs, or is there a push for transparency winning out? I think there's big differences in different issue areas and different institutions. If you're talking about the European Union institutions, which are highly salient and there is public opinion about them, let alone awareness of them, that's one issue. That's one place where I think you might see transparency winning out and the arguments for secrecy more difficult to make, versus institutions like ICSID, even the World Trade Organization and its functions, pretty out of sight, out of mind, and I would say sort of less politicized. There you might be able to see a more technocratic sort of conduct and therefore confidentiality added when it's needed type of situation. So that's an interesting thing for future research, again, to sort out. Agree with Allison on the EU transparency and trade negotiations. Really, our book is focused, to borrow from Fioran's old distinction between the bargaining phase and the enforcement phase of international cooperation. Our book is really focused on the enforcement phase, right? Sensitive information and figuring out, given a set of commitments, is there compliance or not? This is more an issue of the bargaining phase, where folks like David Stasovich's work, as Allison referenced, might tell us that opening it up and making it transparent could make bargaining more difficult. And lastly, do states vary in the use of this confidentiality? I think the answer is, in our book, we don't develop it all that much. In reality, I think yes. You could look at countries like Russia and China, who might view an institution like the IAEA with some suspicion. They may not rush to the entrance to the gates to provide intelligence, even if it's equipped to, if they think the basic mission of the institution might be more directed against states they're allied with, or just not something they're interested in. So I think there is a skepticism in the purpose and function of an IO can translate into probably less interest in engaging in the kind of disclosure process that we're interested in.
I thought you were about to say something else. Okay, I think that is all the time we have for today. It is now 4 p.m. in Central European time. So I wanted to thank our guests, Professor Allison Carnegie, Professor Austin Carson, and Professor Yoram Haftel, as well as the audience for joining us today and taking part in this webinar. And before leaving you, I would like to remind you that the Globe webinar series will continue next month with a webinar on the 18th of November, featuring Kristen Hopewell on her new book, Clash of Powers, U.S.-China Rivalry and Global Trade Governance. So please join us for that one. You can register at globe-project.eu, and you can also see the rest of our fall and winter lineup. We have them scheduled through February, and you can also catch up on all the previous episodes of our webinar series. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. From all of us at the Globe Project, thank you, and goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.